Welcome back. The IMF has just released its World Economic Outlook for the month of January at the moment for 2022, and it isn't good news because it suggests that global growth projections are being slashed by around half a percentage point lower than what was the case just a few months ago. Joining me now is Gita Gopinath, the Deputy Managing Director of the IMF. Appreciate your joining us, Dr. Gopinath. The big question, it appears that the mood isn't as positive and robust as it is today as it was even 3 months ago. Is there a fear that 2022, particularly because of the Omicron wave, has led you to believe that the outlook is a little worrying, somber?
Hi, Rajdeep. For the global economy, we have a downgrade of half a percentage point for this year. I would not attribute that to Omicron. Omicron has a big hit in our forecast for the first quarter of this year, but its effect is expected to wear out starting the second quarter. So for the year as a whole, the downgrades are driven more by significant downgrades for the US and for China, and not so much the Omicron variant.
In fact, the US and China seem to be the focus of your concerns over a possible decline in growth rate. India, on the other hand, a bit better. You've slashed it by 0.5% to 9%, but still better than most emerging markets.
So we have cut India's forecast for 21-22 fiscal by half a percentage point, and that's basically because the first quarter of this year enters the fiscal 21-22. So because of that, the Omicron has an effect on the numbers about half a percentage point, which means that the recovery is somewhat delayed into the next fiscal year, and therefore you have the upgrade for the next fiscal year. So our numbers really haven't changed that much for India relative to what we had for October. Again, India is recovering from a very deep recession in 2020. So we had there was the rebound in 2021. The country is back to pre-pandemic levels now, and we're continuing to project a recovery.
Well, what you are also projecting, and this is the troubling point, is inflation. You seem to suggest with inflationary pressures, with supply disruptions continuing, that's the big concern which could lead possibly to a Fed rate hike and increase monetary squeeze. Is that the real concern in the near term, at least, these inflationary pressures?
I would say that is a major concern. We are seeing very high inflation numbers in major economies, and especially in the US. It ended last year with inflation at 7%, well above the Fed's 2% on average target. So interest rates will go up. The question is how much. But I think everybody has to get used to a world of higher global interest rates, unlike what we saw in 2021 and 2020. And then there could definitely be turbulence in markets, as we're seeing right now.
Your report doesn't, and presumably because it was written before the latest flashpoint in Ukraine and the fears of a Russian invasion of Ukraine, which again could become a major risk going ahead. Is there a fear that 2022, therefore, given the fact that there are still variants out there, COVID variants, plus these flashpoints in different parts of the world, could be potentially another turbulent year?
Well, there certainly are many challenges for this year. The Ukraine-Russia conflict is something we're watching very closely. Headline inflation has gone up pretty much everywhere in the world because of the increase in energy prices. And such a conflict will certainly push energy prices up even more, given that we're still in winter months in many parts of the world. So that is a major risk, which we are following very closely. I think the other one is indeed what can happen with newer variants, what form they take. A third kind is what happens in terms of U.S. monetary policy, whether the transition to higher interest rates is smooth or it causes interest rates to spike very sharply around the world, which then has implications. And then the last factor, I would say, is in China, in terms of the weakness in the real estate sector, and also the implications of China's zero-COVID policy for shutdowns and therefore for global supply chains. So there are a whole bunch of challenges that the world economy faces.
But when do you see the situation returning to pre-pandemic levels? Whether it's wage growth, labor force participation rates, employment rates, different countries showing different trends. The United States, a sharp decline in unemployment, accompanied by buoyant nominal wage growth, but other parts of the world struggling at the moment, including Europe. Do you see, therefore, the world returning to a pre-pandemic level possibly in 2023?
The world as a whole is already back to the pre-pandemic level. Like, the question is whether it's back to where it would have been in the absence of the pandemic. There are some countries that are there already, which is the US, but most countries, for instance, including India, are certainly not there. So countries are recovering at very different speeds. Our projection for inflation specifically, again, is country-specific. So for the US, and for instance, for the euro area, we have inflation declining, especially in the second half of this year. But for the US, it's still going to end the year with inflation quite a bit above the Fed's target, while on the other hand, for the euro area, it will end the year quite close to the ECB's target. So again, in terms of the direction, we have inflation coming down for much of 2022, but for several countries, it's going to take until 2023 to actually come back down to their targets.
Let me come back to India for a moment, because we are speaking just a few days before the Union Budget 2022. Most nations, including India, have been dependent on higher public investment to boost growth. Private investment picking up slowly, consumer demand a big concern. If you were finance minister or advisor to the finance minister, what would you suggest? Any 2 or 3 issues that you believe are critical bullet points going ahead?
Well, I would first say that fiscal policy should stay accommodative for another year. They have kept it accommodative for the last year too, so I would say keep it accommodative for the next year, just given the fact that this is still an ongoing recovery and much more ground has to be covered. Within that envelope, I would say that you should focus on having a more inclusive recovery. So there are pieces in what the government has been doing in terms of providing subsidized food staples. For instance, free food staples, that's supposed to expire sometime in March. You could consider extending it. Keeping the broader envelope for the Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme, and also in terms of expanding it to urban workers and migrant workers, that's something also to be considered. In terms of sectors, I think the priorities should be health, education, and infrastructure. I think that's absolutely essential in the health sector, everybody understands, but even in education, the big hit to learning that's happening, that has to be reversed. Attention will have to be paid to that. There was a considerable amount of public infrastructure investment that's happened that should be maintained. And then the one last piece is that all of this should, of course, be done with a very clearly communicated medium-term fiscal strategy, which will signal how the deficits will come down over time.
Very quickly, in conclusion, if you look at your economic outlook, as I said at the outset, you weakened Brazil, you're worried about disruption in the housing sector in China, inflation a concern, particularly in the United States. Given all of that, do you think India is in a slightly better place than many other parts of the world today?
I think countries in the world are facing their own specific challenges. In the case of India, India is back to pre-pandemic levels, but again, if you accumulate the growth over 2 years, and even including our projection for this year, there's still a gap with the potential for India's economy. And so this is why all of these additional measures will need to be continued. The other piece, of course, which India is grappling with, which many other countries are grappling with, is that even within your own economy, there are some sectors that are recovering very rapidly. Large firms, large industries are recovering very rapidly, while SMEs are still having a hard time. So it's going to take some time to recover, and countries are, like I said, just facing very different challenges.
Okay. Dr. Gita Gopinath, for giving us a sense of how the world could look in 22-23 and the challenges that lie ahead and the risks that lie ahead. Appreciate your joining me here tonight. Thank you very much.
Thank you.